Okay, hi, so I'm Caroline and I will be talking to Fergus, who's kindly agreed to come along and talk about their mother's theory, which is monotropism. So Dinah Murray, who actually was somebody who was at the start of AutAngel, was quite involved and very supportive. She was very helpful, and she was sort of a linchpin of the autistic community generally, and knew everybody, and just was wonderful at helping people smooth over the sorts of little difficulties that occur in communities. But I must admit, I never quite got her belief in this theory that the monotropism theory was a unifying theory of autism, which explained everything about it. So I'm really delighted that that Fergus is willing to come along and explain it all to us and talk to us about it as well. So how this will go is it will be 40 minutes of, well, start with Fergus explaining the monotropism theory, and then I'll chat to him for about, I don't know, however long, but we'll leave 20 minutes at the end for your questions, which we'd like you to put into chat at that point. So, oh yeah, I was going to say a bit about Fergus, who is a science teacher and also a brilliant puppet maker. And we will send you a link to his website where you can see some of the puppets that he's made later, when we send out the information about the talk. Oh, you've got, oh, right. I was thinking of those enormous puppets. But great, you've got little things as well. Thank you. So take it away, Fergus.
Right, so monotropism posits that autistic attention is more likely to be focused on a small number of things at a time than non-autistic people's attention. To put it another way, we tend to have fewer interests aroused at the time, where interests are basically things which draw our attention in, right? If you're interested in something, then your attention is drawn to it. This has all sorts of consequences, because so many things require attention, right? Anything that we think about, anything that our brains do really requires attention. So because we tend to focus more of our processing resources on a small number of things, we tend to be worse at working with multiple channels at a time, which has all sorts of social consequences. I think this also goes for filters. Filtering is an active process and it takes energy, it takes attention. Not necessarily conscious attention, but I'm using the word attention in a sort of broad sense. Sometimes Dinah likes to talk about processing resources, because it's not clear that attention quite covers everything that is more concentrated in autistic thinking. But yeah, so having our processing resources relatively concentrated means that we have less left over, for example, filtering out background noises or filtering out all sorts of different things. In social interactions, it means that we're likely to miss body language if we're focusing on words. And it means that we tend to express ourselves differently because of the way that we're using attention. In a lot of ways, it means that autistic people have to think about things consciously, which seem to come naturally to other people. Also, of course, it lends itself to getting lost in our interests, to kind of intense absorption with things that we are especially interested in. You know, the diagnostic criteria talk about restricted and repetitive behaviors and interests. And I think that just describes passions. If you're passionately interested in something, then you're going to repeatedly return to it. That's just how intense interests work. And autistic people are just more prone to that than other people are. So it's not clear that that our interests are actually any more restricted. Certainly, speaking for myself, I am interested in a huge number of different things. I just tend to be very, very interested in one thing at a time, and then I'll jump to another thing later. Also, because our processing resources are focused in the way that they are, we often experience things quite strongly. So, for example, sensory processing, and I think there are two sides to that. One is when we do throw our processing resources at a particular stimulus, we tend to very vividly experience it. You know, this accounts for a lot of the sensory seeking behavior in autism. But also, we tend to be filtering fewer things out, so that in noisy environments, in environments with sort of visual clutter, we're often worse at filtering out all of that stuff and more likely to be distracted. We also tend to make different connections from other people because we think about things differently. We often miss connections that to other people seem obvious, and other people often miss connections that to us seem obvious. And I think that's to do with, again, tending to focus our attention more tightly than most people, so that we'll sort of follow a chain of inferences without necessarily kind of looking at all of the side branches that other people might think of, because at each step they have more interests activated, they have more connections activated. I think those are pretty much the main points. I'm sure that we'll come back to some of them and expand on various things as we go.
So I suppose what puzzles me is, well, it seems to me that what you're doing is describing various aspects of autism rather than explaining them. Like, and also it's, yeah. So when you say, for instance, that we throw our resources at a stimuli, that I would say that almost the reverse happens for people who have sensory overstimulation. So if you're thinking about somebody who's you know, hypersensitive to sound, they would rather not be hypersensitive to sound.
Sometimes, yeah. A lot of that is about filtering, like I said. So being less able to filter out sounds than other people can be very stressful.
Yeah, but that's not being able to filter out sounds is separate to hypersensitivity to sound. So the people for whom it's actually pain, you know, who can't use public toilets, for instance.
Well, so the way that I would characterize that is that when our attention is drawn to something, it's really very drawn to it. So, you know, we're exposed to a stimulus, and having registered it consciously, it really, really registers. You know, we tend to experience it in those things intensely.
I suppose I just have to like I would say that I, for instance, am slightly hypersensitive to noise. I mean, not such that it's pain. Like, I accept that there are people, as I say, who can't use public toilets because of the noise of the dryer is actually painful to them. Mm. And that's not a choice. Whereas I get more irritated than I would like, actually, than a neurotypical person might at invasive noise. But that's sort of a separate thing so I'm less able, to me, we're less able to direct our attention. So that's about attention control rather than that we have restricted, you know, that there's somehow one channel.
I I mean, my feeling is that we're less able to direct our attention because there's so much of it. It's like trying to steer a heavily laden shopping trolley. You know, there's a lot of momentum behind our attention in a way that there is less for other people.
But also the other thing, it's quite interesting because you mentioned having to think through things consciously that come naturally to other people. And for me, that's something that happens particularly in social processing. So I see social processing as something where autistic people do have to do it consciously, which is why, you know, I've always thought there are a lot of autistic psychologists, etc., because we don't naturally understand it. So we go learn about it. And then we might be very good at the theory, but still can't do it in real time. So that's where, but the thing of having that as a theory of that's how we process, that breaks down because the reverse is also true. Whereas you have some autistic people who, for instance, are, you know, really just could multiply, say, 53 times 78, just like that, without, whereas I would have to write it down and do long multiplication. These people would do it intuitively, so are able to actually miss the steps that non-autistic people make.
Well, the better you get at something, the less you have to think about it.
No, but
a lot of the time, when you see autistic people with extraordinary mathematical abilities, for example, they've spent hours and hours multiplying things in their heads. So it gets to be unconscious. You know, they don't have to think through the many steps of it because they've hyper-focused on it and built up these skills. Well,
I don't know if have you heard of Daniel Tammet?
I've definitely heard the name.
So he's like an autistic savant who apparently he learned Icelandic in a week, like such that he was able to speak fluently to somebody. And he's also written about how he does, like he can do these maths things. I mean, he's quoted pi, which apparently is infinite. You probably know this as a science teacher, but was news to me. It's infinite. And he's like quoted it for 5 hours without making a mistake. Right. But the interesting part about it is that it's visual for him. So I mean, this doesn't make any sense to me, but this is what he writes, and I would tend to believe him. Why would he lie? That he has when he's multiplying something, he has 2 different pictures in his head, and then he comes up with a third one that he translates to the answer. So he hasn't had to do, like, I know this memory thing where there are techniques that people have learned, but some people are just gifted at things and some people aren't, you know. And I think the people who can do this with math, because people get into trouble, like, you know, Damien, who you all know as well, said he was one of the people who get marked down for not showing the workings in maths when they didn't do any workings, because it just came. Yeah, but that's not because you've done a lot of it. It's because your mind doesn't. Yeah, but so what I find interesting is that, but in the social sphere, there aren't autistic people who are socially apt. Like, there are definitely autistic people who get on well with other people, who are seen to be kind and who do bits of it. And I think but mostly autistic people will make faux pas because we're not able to do, because we miss the one aspect of non-verbal communication. I don't know what it is, but we miss an aspect.
Well, I mean, I think a lot of that comes down to the usual expectation of multi-channel processing in communication. You know, most people, when they're communicating, they're emoting with their face, they're modulating their tone of voice, they're, you know, expressing themselves with body language and using words, and eye contact communicates a lot. And we're much worse at doing all of that at the same time. But also, I do think that actually some autistic people probably are very socially skilled. But we've got the situation where the diagnostic criteria insists that anyone who counts as autistic must have problems with social communication.
Well, no,
so
I mean,
there are people with the same neurotype who are just sufficiently interested in people early on and attend sufficiently to communication that they aren't eligible for diagnosis of autism because they don't fit that particular criterion, even though they may well have the exact same cognitive differences as the rest of us.
Well, that's quite interesting, isn't it? Because then it takes up the whole, given that there's no objective biological thing, we can't really have this discussion. You know what I mean? It's like, you can't say, well, there's this person who's autistic, but they don't have this autistic trait. Because I suppose what I'm positing separately is that the central autistic trait that every autistic person I know has is social atypicality. And that atypicality can vary. I'm not saying that we're all the same socially, but that we aren't, that people have always felt different. Or most people have felt different, because I accept, and in fact, Dinah was one of the people who said that she was brought up in an environment where she felt very accepted and sort of the same. And at a certain point it hit her, but she also told me that she was in her 50s when she realized that people sometimes pretended to feel things for, you know, to manipulate a situation. So even though you could say she was socially, you know, fine, but she was socially different as well. And that's sort of, I just honestly don't see how that fits with the idea of monotropism. Because, hang on, I'm just going to go sideways a bit with this, because you're saying, okay, there's lots of different things that have to be integrated. Well, if I think of something I really can't do, even worse than socialize, is dance, which is where you're having to integrate like various movements. Well, some autistic people are superb at that.
Yeah.
So there are other things where you're having to process lots of different information at the same time, which actually everybody does when you're seeing things 3D. I mean, that's incredibly complex. And people who are born with sight just do it.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a psychological phenomenon known as chunking, where, you know, you stop seeing things as lots of separate things and you understand how they all fit together, and then you can work with them on that level rather than at the level of, you know, individual chess pieces, for example. And a novice chess player sees 32 pieces and tries to think about how each of them moves. An expert chess player sees, oh yes, it's the Da Vinci opening or whatever. That's almost certainly not a real opening, but you know, they recognize the overall shape of the board, and they think about things on that level. So there's much less for them to think about. And that's totally feasible with something like dancing. You know, it's all under your control. And if you're dancing with someone else, then less so, but still there aren't that many variables actually to keep track of. Whereas with humans, they're just endlessly variable and totally unpredictable in a lot of ways. Well, so there's only so much skill that you can get based on chunking and like learning things about people.
Well, yeah, but that's what I'm really saying. I mean, we're sort of agreeing and disagreeing at the same time. So I'm saying actually that if the problem is technical in terms of not being able to accumulate certain bits of information, then people would have, like, already people have varied things that they're skilled at. So for instance, however long you trained me, honestly, I would not be able to dance. And I mean, also, if you think about drawing, some people can naturally, you know, are clearly very gifted, and other people are just never going to get there. They're just not. Because there are too many very, very subtle things. Like life is actually quite complicated. I think we can agree. But so it just doesn't work for me, the idea that we have problems socializing because it's more complex than any other thing. I mean, I remember my son, before either of us knew we were autistic, saying exactly that to me, saying dealing with people is so complicated. You know, there's so many things that are, you know, he found it difficult and said that. And of course it's true, but there are other things that he does which are difficult for somebody like me in the same way, but that come naturally to him. So I suppose what I'm saying is different people intuit different things, and that the monotropism thing doesn't explain why it's specifically difficult for autistic people to intuit other human beings rather than other sorts of things.
I'm not sure it is specifically difficult. I mean, there's all sorts of things that autistic people find it difficult to intuit.
No, but, yeah.
And like, from my point of view, the complexity of human society and the variability of humans means that monotropism and that sort of tendency to only be able to focus, to process like one or a small number of channels at a time, really fully explains the social differences that I see. Whereas the social differences don't explain any of the other features of autism, right? And
oh no, that's I agree.
And they are, and you know, they cry out for explanation. You know, the fact that sensory differences didn't make it into diagnostic manuals for like decades is incredibly weird when you talk to autistic people, and almost all of us have sensory differences.
Look, I'm totally with you. I don't think that the social differences that explains everything about autism. I just think, given that I don't really get monotropism, and I'm trying to sort of unpick why I don't get it, you know, from, you know, a theory from somebody who I respect very much, and a lot of people seem to be taking on board at the moment. So I'm trying to explain, I'm trying to elicit how it explains that while other very complex things can be taken on by autistic people, that particular thing seems to be common amongst most autistic people. And also the sensory difference, I'd also argue, isn't explained adequately by monotropism. So because of the lack of choice, so yes, there's a lack of ability. I mean, to me, that's more the ADHD thing, where, which is, to me, is a lack of ability to control one's attention in line with one's other abilities, if you like. But the sensory thing is not really about, it's about having your bodily, your interoception, your bodily awareness hijacked by the environment.
Right, because we can't filter as much as most people.
But nobody can filter sensory things.
Yes, no, they can to a large extent. And we do it all the time. And you know, there are tests on people's ability to filter when they're tired, for example, and they're less able to tune out intrusive stimuli. So it's not, you know, it's not like we can't filter and other people can, but as a strong tendency, we filter out fewer things than other people. And to me, that fits completely with the monotropism hypothesis.
I suppose I don't really see it as filtering out, because it's not that you're so filtering out, I would say, is like irrelevant stuff in the environment. Like you want to do something and you're being intruded on by other things, that's filtering out. Whereas a sensory thing is something where your body is experiencing something at a different level to other people, in a choiceless way to you. Yeah. So I mean, no, so when I said nobody can filter stuff out, I mean, obviously people do filter out background stuff. I meant we're all wearing clothes now, and it would be socially unacceptable not to, but otherwise, if we didn't have heating, we'd all get cold. Like we couldn't make, well, unless we were some very advanced sort of, I think yogic practitioners can change their body temperature, but you know, most people can't.
So, I mean, there certainly are stimuli that we can't filter out. It's not like it's just about that, but.
Okay, I'm going to switch because I feel like we're sort of not moving. What advantages, what use do you think, how do you think the monotropism theory is helpful?
I think it helps make sense of the seemingly disparate features of autism. And I think it can be very helpful for people in understanding both themselves and others. You know, having a set of supposed facts about autistic people which don't seem to relate to each other in any kind of discernible way is difficult to work with, for one, and most of those facts are only true some of the time as well. So you know, for example, the social stuff, you know, if you just read that autistic people lack social imagination and have difficulties with social communication, then it would come as a surprise to see autistic people interacting with each other and actually communicating just as effectively as other people do, for example. So it provides a sort of coherent framework for thinking about autism in a way that none of the other dominant theories of autism do, I think. And it suggests, you know, certain things like it's easy to understand why it takes us time to change tracks, for example. If you understand that autistic people basically are like piling in loads of processing resources to a thing which then has a lot of momentum and, you know, keeps moving forward. And it explains why it's terribly disruptive for us to be thrown off track in a way that executive functioning, where you're only talking about how difficult it is to steer your attention, doesn't. Or at least it doesn't in an intuitively obvious way to me.
Okay, so for you, this is helpful because it brings, you find it a way of bringing all autistic traits under one hat, essentially.
Essentially, yeah. It makes sense of how they connect together, and it allows people to work out things and to make sense of things, you know, either their own behavior or other people's. I've certainly heard from quite a lot of autistic people that they felt like it, you know, finally made sense of how they think differently from other people. And I've heard from teachers and others who, once they heard about it, felt like they were finally starting to make sense of the behaviors of the autistic kids that they worked with, or adults or something.
Okay, I mean, I think that, you know, I definitely think it's a useful part to understand about autism, but I don't, you know, personally, I suppose, see the benefit of having a unified theory. I mean, my own belief is that we're atypical in such different ways. So, you know, that's why I find the constellation model useful, because often autistic people are more different to each other than we are to neurotypicals. And I accept that that can fit with this as well, because you're saying, you know, you've got a strong interest in something, but it might vary what that strong interest is in.
Yeah. And it's important to bear in mind that although autistic people vary enormously, we do have things in common, and there are very strong tendencies in the autistic population. You know, it's not like we're just the people who are really different from everybody else. There are people who are really different from everybody else in really unautistic ways, and that's important.
Yeah, I suppose but I think a lot of it is, for me, a lot of the experience is of feeling outside of the general community and not understanding why. So of being different, you know, and of meeting other so it's like meeting people with a shared experience is a lot of, to me, what autistic community is about. But
sure.
Because so I sort of, so yeah, I don't know if I've got any more questions to ask. I suppose I just feel that I mean, the area of disagreement is quite small in that I'm saying, yes, this is interesting, but it doesn't explain everything. Whereas you're saying it explains everything. I'm just going to finally, like, we'll wrap up in a minute and take questions from the audience. But the final thing I suppose I'd like to ask, just out of curiosity, was as at the time like your mother was quite involved with autism before she herself identified as autistic. Did she identify as autistic herself at the point at which she developed this theory?
Not in the beginning, no. I mean, I'm trying to think. I think that by the time she published with Wen Lawson and Mike Lesser, the what's it called, Attention, Monotropism and the Diagnostic Criteria for Autism, she'd come to think of herself as a sort of autistic cousin, at least. I think that was somewhere around the same time that she published One That Got Away. It's a chapter in Coming Out Asperger's, and in that she described herself as being somewhere on the autistic spectrum. So I think it took her quite a long time to conclude that she was autistic enough to really count.
Right.
As it did with me. Like, I think we sort of reached the same conclusion around about the same time. Like, she was maybe a little bit ahead of me.
Oh, right, that's amazing. I didn't know that. I didn't know that you'd both reached it at the same time. That's really interesting. So you reached it from your own knowledge of autism. So it didn't come via Dinah, you yourself, well, you'd heard about autism via Dinah, and then you thought you recognized it yourself somewhat.
Yeah. I think I talked to her about the prospects of seeking an autism diagnosis, and she was quite ambivalent about it. Not because she thought that I wasn't autistic, but because she was always quite uncomfortable about the whole kind of medical framework.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you. Thanks a lot for being willing to talk about this so openly. And what we'll do is shall we ask people to put questions in chat, and maybe put a Q at the front if it's a question, and maybe Carrie, or I mean, you're welcome to look at them yourself and pick them out if we get loads, because we've got a lot of people here, or Carrie can pick them out and ask you. So we'll just have a little
we did have one a little bit earlier on saying, how does monotropism explain inertia?
Well, for me, it's like you're piling a lot of attention into a trolley sort of thing. So in order to get going with a task, we need to sort of like fill it up. Like we need to direct something which effectively has, a lot of inertia. Like, it takes a lot of resources to get us going, and it takes a lot of resources for us to change track or to stop.
So another question here is, can you recommend some reading to introduce people to the theory of monotropism?
I think I'd probably suggest my starting points for understanding autism on Medium, which I think is probably a little bit more accessible than my piece for the psychologist, which is also probably quite accessible. And so is Dinah's 2018 encyclopedia entry, actually.
So
Monotropism, an interest-based account of autism.
Would you be able to send Carrie links to that so she can send it out to people afterwards?
Yeah, that would be really useful, Fergus, if you don't mind doing that. It just means that what I usually do is I send any links that have come up during the chat or that have been mentioned during the conversation, and then people can go and look them up and find out more that way.
Yeah. If anyone's up for reading a book-length exploration of the idea, then Wen Lawson's A Passionate Mind is the classic.
So somebody has actually Well done, thank you, person. Charlotte, sorry to not use your name, Charlotte, has said, is it possible to disprove monotropism? Well, one can't disprove God, for instance, but anyway, I'll pass that question to you.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, so far we haven't fully worked out a way to measure it, which would be a good step. If we did that and it turned out that autistic people don't tend to be much more monotropic than the rest of the population, then that would be a disproof. I feel about this a bit like the theory of evolution. You know, we're describing a set of observed phenomena in a what to me at least seems like a coherent way. And I'd love to see more empirical evidence. You know, it's been 16 years since they published that piece in Autism, and we really should have seen some empirical work by now. But as it stands, it provides a significantly more complete and coherent explanation of the whole set of autistic characteristics than any other theory that is available.
But maybe there isn't, I suppose my thing is, maybe there isn't a single, just like there's not a single gene, we know that. Maybe a single theory, maybe there's not a single, you know, thing.
Yeah, conceivably. Yeah. And like, I'm open to the possibility that there might be people who currently fit the diagnostic criteria of autism who are not monotropic. And I think that would be interesting to explore. Because, you know, the diagnostic criteria are just our current definition. They don't have any kind of absolute known validity. And it may be that different people fit them for fundamentally very different reasons. And of course, like a really complete theory of autism would have to be a complete theory of humankind. Like, you can't explain everything about autistic people if you can't explain everything about people.
Yeah.
So there's lots of that.
So somebody has asked without a cue, but so I don't know if they're just trying to chat, but it's worth asking you. I think they've said, is the monotropism theory exclusive to autism, or does it also apply to ADHD?
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's a really good question. And certainly a lot of ADHD people identify with descriptions of monotropism. And to me, it looks like it explains many of the features of ADHD, you know, the tendency to lose track of things as soon as your attention is diverted. ADHD people seem to be just as prone to hyperfocus as autistic people are. But obviously there are significant differences in ADHD as it's generally understood and autism as it's generally understood. And I think there's a bit of digging down to do to pin down why not all ADHD people are autistic and vice versa, if monotropism goes some way to explaining both. So I think there's quite a lot in there. Like, you know, the fact that the autistic criteria for autism are so person-focused, they're so focused on the social side of things, whereas the ADHD diagnostic criteria are largely about, you know, attention and tasks, means that they're looking at different things, basically. So it's not all that surprising that it turns out that they're describing many of the same people. But yeah, I mean, I think there's you know, there's stuff in there about novelty seeking in ADHD, which is maybe not so prominent in autism. And yeah, obviously it's possible to get an ADHD diagnosis without having any kind of social difficulty. So there's a lot more research still to do on that front.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think it does fit very well with ADHD because it's about attention, essentially. So another question here from Julie says, how would you explain some of the strengths of autistic individuals through monotropism?
Strengths?
Yeah.
Well, a lot of that is down to our tendency to hyperfocus. you know, autistic people are much more likely to, for example, spend a lot of time doodling when other people are just hanging out, or, you know, spend time researching things extensively. And that's largely because our interests keep on pulling us onto the same tracks. And so we get a lot more practice in the things that we're particularly interested in. I also think that there's probably something in there about a sort of drive to completeness, where I think, you know, because we get so invested in the things that we're particularly interested in, we really want to see them to completion, through to completion a lot of the time. Certainly, I'd see that in myself. Although at the same time, I have strong ADHD tendencies, and I'm, you know, currently awaiting a diagnosis for that as well. And when I'm not sufficiently invested in something, my attention is liable to hop all over the place.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that makes sense to me, that it does explain the strengths due to the intensity of interest would make you stronger. Like, you've got a stronger interest in something, so that would make you, as you say, research it better and just be stronger at it, I suppose. So,
and conversely, we tend to be really terrible at some other things, which are either we're less interested in them, or you know, our attention has just been pulled away from that, and we've just never developed skills in it that other people have. So it explains both, like, the highs and the lows of the spiky skills profile that is common in autism, I think.
I suppose it's interesting because I just don't see attention as being the sole arbiter of skill in a thing. Like, I think one can be very interested in a thing and still end up being very unskilled at it.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely not the sole arbiter, but I think it maybe has more of a role than most people think. Like, there's an assumption that autistic savants are just, you know, bam, they're just really good at maths. They can just do these calculations and that's it. Like we never need to practice. And I don't think that's how it works.
Okay. Okay, so another question from Sean says, thoughts on the intense world theory? It seems like it kind of fits with monotropism.
Yeah, it kind of does, but it's less good at accounting for the non-intense bits, if you like. Yeah, in a lot of ways, I think it's coming from a similar place, and like a lot of it works well together. But you know, the fact that we are probably almost as prone to experiencing things less intensely as we are to experiencing things more intensely, right, requires some explanation. And I don't think intense world theory really does that. I also think it's probably a bit weak on general processing differences. Like it focuses quite heavily on the perceptual domain. And I think it's pretty clear that we autistic people have substantial processing differences, which are not really to do with that. Although they could still be seen in terms of intensity. So
I suppose it's like there are different lenses that one can see something through, and the thing is still the same. So another question here from Colleen says, does monotropism suggest so-called deficits are solely due to attentional differences? For example, if an autistic person would be directed to pay attention to facial cues, for example, would they be just as skilled at identifying them if they are paying attention? Many theories make it seem like even if an autistic person pays attention, they still can't identify what they're observing.
Yes and no. I mean, I think a lot of autistic people are actually pretty good at identifying facial expressions, for example, as long as we're not trying to deal with too much else at the same time. So in a way, yes, but because we tend to be less good at spreading our attention over many channels at once, there are things which are inevitably harder, I think.
So there's a question from Claire, says, Kieran Rose applies monotropism to far more than attention tunnels, as you've done very well tonight too, and uses monotropism to theorize about autistic sensory experience among other areas of autism. Fergus, are you familiar with Kieran Rose's take on monotropism, and if so, do you have an opinion?
I haven't got round to reading about it in depth. Yeah, I mean, I think he published that thing while Dinah was very sick, and I haven't got back to it yet.
Right. Okay.
But you know, he's a smart guy. He's got interesting things to say.
So, so somebody here says, I was a member, Harriet, I was a member of Mensa at 10, and I don't remember practicing. My father just used to play number games with me in the car or the bath.
That's practicing.
Good point. Yeah, fair enough. Yeah. That seems to be it, with actual questions that people have put a Q in front of. So if you have got something that you would like to ask Fergus, there's a lot of chat in here. So it's possible that I've missed a question with a Q, or that you've asked a question without a Q and I have not been able to read it through. So if you'd like to ask a question to Fergus, please put a Q in front of it. But don't you think there are that intuitive, like the example that I usually give, because I do think that social processing is something that non-autistic people do intuitively and autistic people don't. And the example I give is catching a ball, where you could theoretically work out where the ball would be, and that would, and you'd have to, you'd never catch it in real time. Whereas in actual fact, your hand just does it. So you intuitively know. And
Right.
that non-autistic people are able to do that with, that's the mechanism they use for understanding other people's thoughts. But autistic people have to go through that whole think process. And yes, we get quicker at it, but it never becomes like catching a ball to us with people we don't know. So it does feel like it's sort of a slightly different thing to attentional choice, which was what the question somebody else asked.
Yeah. Let me add one more thing on that, which is that I think autistic people naturally express ourselves differently. Like our body language tends to be different. Our facial expressions are often different from other people. And that sort of adds, and I think that can be explained by monotropism, but I think that adds an extra layer to the social thing, because most people are able to recognize their own expressions on other people, for example, and their own, ways of expressing things. And when they express things in a certain way, other people respond to them as if they have the emotions which are most commonly associated with that way of expressing something. So yeah, there are a lot of just knock-on effects from just being different from an early age, and I think that has to be taken into account when you're thinking about why we have these social differences and difficulties.
I suppose it's just, for me, that's the clearest area that monotropism doesn't explain. Because also, to me, there's also hyper-empathy, which is something else that a lot of autistic people actually feel very strongly, the feelings of others, and care very deeply. I mean, that's, we've got Greta Thunberg, who, obviously cares very deeply about the world, because something sort of gets under her skin in a way that it often doesn't for non-autistic people. And I don't know how, I mean, if you agree, in fact, Wen Lawson, which I just found interesting, what I'd always called hyper-empathy, Wen Lawson called emotional contagion. And I think those two things, it's hard to have firm line, but how would you explain the fact that autistic people, in terms of monotropism, how does the tendency to emotional contagion fit in?
Well, I think it fits in with the tendency towards intense experiences. You know, once we're tuned into someone else's emotions, we're likely to feel them very intensely, because that is going to draw in more of our resources than it would for a lot of people.
Okay.
But we also, you know, sometimes have trouble tuning into other people's emotions.
Well, I think I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I do think, you know, there's a big variety amongst autistic people with the emotions. Aha, we've now got, with 3 minutes left to go, we've got a final question in the chat here with a queue in front. So thank you, Millie. And well, I think there's been an opportunity for questions. We'll go with this one and see if we've got time for the next one, because it's a bit last minute here. Do you have any thoughts on Simon Baron-Cohen's view, that autism could be seen as an extreme form of the male brain, and his classification of autism as a form of 0 degrees of empathy? Well, at least, Fergus, I think this is something we can 100% agree on here.
Yeah,
I think.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, it's a bit frustrating, because I think he gets some things right.
Yeah, no,
the whole overall framing is just so, like, grossly awful that it's quite difficult to take it seriously. So, you know, yeah, it's true, autistic people have a tendency towards systemizing. The whole empathy thing just requires a lot more unpicking than he ever seems to give it credit for. Like, it's a complex thing. It's not like some people are very empathetic and other people are not. And it's really, the distinction between cognitive and affective empathy doesn't really get to the root of it either.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
See, that's interesting, because I actually think, he knows, you know, he has headlines that are just career boosting for him, that he knows to be untrue, this lack of empathy. And then he divides it up. So then he says, oh yeah, well, they just lack, you know, us being a they, lack cognitive empathy and not affective empathy. But I do think that we do have more problems thinking about the thoughts of others than the feelings of others.
Well, I think that's so much about double empathy problem, right? Other people think about things differently from us, therefore it's harder to understand how they're feeling about things.
No, but
whereas when it comes to other autistic people, our cognitive empathy is totally intact, as far as I can tell.
Okay. Yeah, I think on this point, we've now reached the time. I mean, I think we have to agree to disagree to some extent, but it's been really interesting and lovely to speak with you.
Yeah,
and, thanks a lot for being with us. I don't know if you want to answer the final question here, which is from Amma, saying, do you think monotropism can explain the tendency to avoid demands so intensely focused? I don't know how, I'm trying to read this, but I'm not sure I understand the question. Do you think monotropism can explain the tendency to avoid demands as so intensely focused on something and hard to withdraw from that? That's the question.
Right. Yeah, I think I get what they're asking. I think that's certainly a common reason for avoiding demands. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think a lot of demand avoidance is about rebelling against people trying to pull us out of our attention tunnels.
Okay. So right now we are going to we're going to expel everybody from this attention tunnel. So thanks again, everybody, for coming along, and thanks especially to you, Fergus, for sharing your deep understanding of monotropism.
Thanks, everyone.
Here we go. Right.